Very good afternoon, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to share some of the insights today. And the title of what I've got, my presentation is quickly on comics and ideology, a brief critique on the South African landscape, looking specifically at the apartheid and post-apartheid context. And just to set up a little bit of a prologue, the past decade, we've witnessed a major comic book renaissance. And part of this, if we look at the statements by Corey Blake and David Pittencott, we see that the comic book renaissance can be articulated to almost three dimensions that actually impacted us greatly. The first one is the compelling component of popular culture, the revival of the 20th century popular culture that has made the market much more viable. We've also seen a new level of literary acceptance, and the fact that we've got Yusef with us, that actually is evidence to the fact that these that there's a source, there's a move towards literature or knowledge from the periphery to the mainstream knowledge spaces as well. Then we've also seen the advent of comic studies as an academic discipline in higher education institutions. And this is particularly in the South African context, and I know Ray can attest to this as well from his space, that we've seen the emergence of comic studies onto the higher education landscape. Now, in addition to comic books, we've also seen that there is an emergence of a critical discourse space, specifically in the South African context, as I'm going to show you, that we find that it emulates society's values, ideals, prejudice, but also there's an offering of a social commentary and critique of critical issues, very much in the context of the Black Lives Movement that we saw recently. Now, the South African context, comic books were once reserved, if you look at the apartheid kind of context and previously, to a very privileged class, but based on economic affordability. But now we've seen an emergence of a subculture across the social classes, across races. And this is attracting both readers in the form of consumers, but also producers to produce the type of content, the type of graphics, the type of stories, narratives that are emerging from these spaces. And you can see some of these in the graphics that are emerging. Now, why specifically comics and ideology? Now, when we talk of ideology, we're talking of social power. And in the context of comic books, it's the ability to challenge, perpetuate power differences, but also how do we use comic books to legitimize dominant values and institutions in society, as was articulated by McAllister and Sewell and Goddard in the introduction to their book on comics and ideology. But if we have to shift a little bit towards Vivian Burr's understanding of theorizing of social constructionism, and she notes 4 important elements that I think even in any context we should take into consideration. The first is a critical stance towards our taken for granted ways of understanding the world and ourselves. And the second one is we commonly understand the world in categories and concepts we use as historically and culturally specific. And this is quite important for us in the South African context of how we are producing these comic books that represent the identity from the South African context. And then knowledge of the world is constructed by people and between people through their daily interactions. And this becomes how we see indigenous knowledges emerging from the periphery onto the center stages. But then knowledge and social action also goes together, which is a construction of seeing how social action is used to address human rights issues, etc. Now, comics and ideology, why is an analysis of comics in the South African context important? The first thing we know that there's a history of comics and their controversies from apartheid to post-apartheid, and we've seen these in different elements. There's also a persuasive rhetoric and psychoanalytical nature of comics, which we need to also foreground as we start engaging with comics, even in the global context as well. But there's also that interpretation versus closed ideological text. And in this case, it is the imposition of the reader, the preferred meanings that is communicated through these spaces to the reader. And then there's the understanding of comics as a form of social significance, the social political context. But there's also, if we look at how the debates in construction of knowledge is emerging in the South African context, there's also comic books as an alternative knowledge production spaces, counter-hegemonic discourses, and leading to the other point of the Africanization and the decolonization of knowledge in these spaces. And if we look at the imagery of where Brenda Fassie was institutionalized, historicized in a comic space itself, talking about the end of apartheid, etc., by her music itself, popular culture. Now, one of the most controversial pieces, if we look at, was Mighty Man, the human enforcing dynamo. And I know Ray is going to speak a little bit about this as well. But just to set the context for this, Africa Comics Production House was established in the mid-1970s as a front to disguise the apartheid government's participation in producing propaganda. It was part of a 5-year secret propaganda war with an estimated 64 million generated towards this type of developments against the external and internal critics of the apartheid regime. Mighty Man first was released around 1975 with the primary purpose of countering communist and SWAPO propaganda among South African blacks, but also to promote law and order and a sense of compliance to the apartheid laws. Something quite interesting happened in the 1976 Soweto uprising. And if you look at the kind of narratives, they say they set him, not literally a person, but set him, Mighty Man in these comic books, on fire as part of the protest. And that kind of pushed me to think about why was this resistance towards Mighty Man at that specific time in the history of our South African history in 1976, when there was this mass conscientization of our younger youth towards the apartheid regime and the oppressive systems that emerged. These comic books, it's very difficult to find them in the South African context, but it's actually archived in the University of California, Los Angeles, in the digital archives as well. So let's look at a bit about this as I try to set some context for this. The narrative, the main character, Danny Lomo, police operations was in Soweto, in South Africa. Now, as you know, the Soweto is an historic place that has much more than just the kind of attribution of history towards it. Much of our leaders also emerged from this particular context. In terms of race, how our Mighty Man is positioned, a black human mutate, and his powers are superhuman strength. Now, the transformation is quite interesting of how it's actually positioned. He was a police officer who was shot by thieves during a robbery, and due to his injury, he was forced to retire from the police force, and as a result, he encountered a race of underground creatures, kind of mixing up of the traditional narratives that we find in comic books to now finding of a transformation of Danny Shlomo into a superhuman. Now, with this ability, he emerges as Mighty Man, fighting for justice in inverted commas and law. And as we can see in these comics, the narratives on the side, a Mighty Man, vigil constant, is pursued for relentless and punishment swift. Now, these are the kind of terminologies, the ideologies, the punishment of who, swift punishment of who, emerging in this text that we find. Now, the type of ideologies, and I've looked at three kind of sub-themes that are emerging here. The first one is social compliance. While Mighty Man's enemies and his main fight is against the drug lords, gangsters, and thieves in Soweto, there's an explicit message in the text of compliance to the law. And the question is, if this wasn't just a compliance to the law against the gangsters and drug lords, it would be understandable. But we need to understand the context behind this. Compliance to whose law? And in this case, it was the South African apartheid government system law that was being forced and compelled through these as a type of propaganda. Now, the type of undertones emerging in the series is that compliance generates. Now, if we look at this, the little abstract on the side, a man who is proud of his people and their glorious heritage, a man who is aware of his strength and noble character, the honesty and generosity of those blacks who work on the surface of Africa. So what we're finding here is that compliance creates this idea of being noble, of being honest and generous. That's the idea that is emerging as part of this discourse in this particular time. And this stands, Mighty Man now stands in contrast to those that don't accept the type of apartheid regime, the type of regulations, and the kind of representation of these oppositions in the text. Now watch this very carefully. The criminal snakes, the vermin who have forgotten the great legacy of their forefathers. So we can see this very play of words, play of representation that is emerging as part of this discourse of how Soweto is conceptualized in this particular text. The second one is the ideology, the law compliance. And this is quite important as we see in these type of comic book representations. The power play as seen in the images here, in the first image and the second image. The criminal was shot dead in a gun battle with the police. It goes in cases closed. Now that kind of narrative of where the head of this police force simply says a criminal is shot, but it was shot by a police, just put it into a closed case. is something that we have seen recently of the kind of police civil citizens engagements. But this is taken for granted in this narrative. And there's a satire of not questioning the acts of the police, the law enforcement, and a general acceptance of this being a normative in this period. Now, there's also the other, the depiction of the other, the image and representation of the other that stands in opposition to this. And if we look at the kind of terminology, the scum of Africa, and those are very, very strong kind of conceptualizations of imaging of the other that is emerging in these texts. Those are the stands on the opposite sides, right? Opposing, if you look at it, he calls him the stick-up men, darker peddlers, burglars, muggers, murderers. So the kind of ideas that are coming is creating this distinctions between the society of those that are standing on the apartheid side, compliance with the law, versus those that are not compliant with the law regime. But then there's also the idea, or the third element, which is the Western traditional compliance. And this I thought was quite ironic the way they positioned this. But in contrast to how we see the emerging powers of more modern day superheroes, the depiction of mighty man drinking a cup of Ceylon tea stands in contrast to the imaging of shebeens, which is the informal bars serving alcohol in Soweto, for example, right? This also borders on a type of commercialization strategy, a deculturalization of the Black mindset towards a culturalization of what it means to be Western. The idea of Ceylon tea versus a shebeen, someone sitting in a shebeen. So that kind of discourses plays out quite critically in how the government at that particular time tried to create an alternative view towards a type of civilization. Now, my epilogue, as I round up, it's just a few minutes that we have, and I know that Ray's going to build on this much further. But as we look at from where comic books emerged with Mighty Man in the 1970s and the apartheid state, and how they use this as a way of propaganda, and we look at some of the current comic books, and I just took one example because this was produced by someone sitting on the another prominent writer, but somebody sitting on the periphery trying to create these type of discourses, Gashwal Brooks. And his comic book on Ntati Molefe, and how he positions it as transformative discursive spaces, right? That challenges the views of how we perceive our urban surroundings, how we perceive culture, how we perceive people in society. But watch what happens in this, colleagues, is a new opportunities to rethink how we frame our superheroes. Ntati Molefe as an opposition to traditional imaging of superheroes. And this is quite profound because generally we see young, energetic, kind of empowered, and here we see a mature aged man, a symbol of wisdom, donning of traditional attire. And his idea of superhero, the idea of being is not the individual gratitude, but a mobilization of the masses as opposed to individual gratitude. And what happens in this kind of comic series is a tackling of explicit social and economic issues, but also there's a contextually relevant to its readers. For those in the South African context who know the Eelbro sitting in Johannesburg, which is also historic, but the kind of representation here is the potential, the transformative discourses, the rethinking as we are finding a new audience emerging and be attracted towards these type of comic books, a subculture emerging. How do we use these type of spaces now as transformative to move beyond the apartheid, move beyond that into a much more empowering space, a discursive space, and a dialogical space? Let me end there and stop there, pause there, and let me hand over to Ray at this time.
Great, thank you so much. And Denzil, thank you so much for your contributions. So interestingly, obviously, Denzil and I had quite a bit of a chat about this beforehand. In fact, we actually had a bit of a laugh when we were saying we were both going to talk about Mighty Man. So my approach to it is more from the visual history and in terms of especially the artist behind it and the weird situations and circumstances that actually happen in the creation of the title itself, and also just the kind of misinformation that was propagated beyond just the sale of Ceylon tea and the very, very obvious apartheid propaganda. So I do need to give a little bit of a content warning about my presentation. It has some rather hurtful images in terms of looking at the history of representation of characters in the beginning. So the first two slides will contain some pretty problematic images, but I do want you to understand that I need to contextualize this in order to best speak the further parts of this presentation. So I do apologize for any kind of offense or harm that is caused by the visuals, but I hope that you understand that this is coming from a research basis, and that I want to try and address this as fairly as possible. So even in the construction of this cover slide, I wanted to actually speak about the repression of expression. And also a lot of what Denzil was saying about compliance equaling conformity. This became something that it was through the subjugation of the humanity of the subjects in the comic that we started to see a loss of representation and a loss of humanity. And as such, the kind of very problematic and overtly racial, I should actually move my screen a bit because my face is in the way. Let me just switch myself off for a second. There we go. All right, so the problem with this particular medium as comics as we understand them is that the representational issues that we encounter even in contemporary times are actually as old as the medium itself. So what I mean there is that we have this quite an extensive history of very, very interesting and very, very problematic visuals in terms of where these things came from. I have a really great quote here by Nicholas Salmond. So I'm not going to read it directly off the screen, but essentially in summary, what he was saying is that basically both animation and comics were equal opportunity racists. So they took every opportunity and every liberality to actually offend and to cause harm visually, and basically no one was safe from the kind of parody and very, very indignant and awful humor that was propagated by the media. So the most important thing, though, is to take note is this is also where the very, very problematic representation of the Black body started to arrive. So the image that we see on the screen currently is from Little Black Sambo, which was actually a 1935 book as well as animated short by Ub Iwerks, who, for those of you that don't know, was actually one of the original animators from the Disney team. In fact, he pretty much pioneered most of Disney's very early black and white shorts because he was just such a prolific creator. And unfortunately, Sambo was one of the many things that he actually assisted in propagating and making almost kind of publicly desirable. So Sambo very much is the most widely reviled representation of the most problematic version of the Black body. It's so it's the very dark skin, the blood red lips, the very small facial features, and again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a form of visual subjugation because it trivializes and essentializes an entire demographic of people into one really, really horrible image. And this also extended beyond many formats. So it wasn't just something that we found in animation and comics, but it was basically just commonplace. It was you would find it in almost anything from children's books through to newspaper articles, editorial cartoons, anything and everything that had some kind of visual content. You'd most likely find the character of the Sambo around it. And the biggest issue, and especially my colleagues will most certainly agree with this, was this also propagated the colonial gaze. And so it started, it's a kind of denigration and racial insensitivity as a reductivist approach to actually dealing with much larger issues because of this kind of implicit superiority that would be laden in these visuals. This is where the issue actually really started to come from. And now this is obviously, it's even older than 1935, but this was the kind of rise of the very problematic images. On the next slide, we have obviously the kind of what I'd like to refer to as the apex of this in terms of Hergé's very problematic Tintin in Congo comic. Now, most people will either be aware of it or will have heard of this kind of the legacy that the comic basically left behind. And the panel I selected here pretty much sums up the entire theme of the comic with this very unfortunate stereotype of the white savior. And this again was where the kind of the subjugation of humanity came from, in that the entire Congolese people, according to this comic, could not help themselves. They had to rely on one pink-skinned, red-haired young man to come and save the world, basically. And this is where a large issue started coming in terms of public culture and public content, because in terms of our access as South Africans to comic media and comic content, a large influx of the titles we especially had during this era were the Francophile comics from Belgium, France, etc. So Tintin, Asterix, and the many other Francophile titles that we would often see in shops like CNA, etc., would obviously contain the very very problematic images that we actually have encountered here on this very slide. And this was the thing. It was so commonplace that it was almost acceptable. And I think that's the larger issue here, is that because of lack of essentially greater access to further titles, this is what we had to read. And it was largely due to things like trade embargoes and sanctions and all sorts of other elements that contributed towards this. But the access here is the biggest issue. And especially with a title as classic as Tintin, where it's almost everyone has either read a Tintin comic or seen one of the many animated films or series, or the animated series. It's a very ubiquitous piece of work, and a lot of people might not be aware that this actually existed because it has been removed from sales and generally isn't really available anymore. And so, again, it's really because of these two images that it kind of summarizes the entire point of this. So representation is a foundational issue. It's something that's not just easily ignored. It's not something that we can just move on and pretend that it never happened. And within understanding, especially as artists and basically artist practitioners, if I had to say it like that, where we have to be mindful of our past in order to correct the future. And I think that's kind of the main thing here when we're looking at addressing any kind of inequality in representation, whether it's LGBT rights, gender rights, racial rights, anything within that realm needs to be remembered in terms of the problematic things that came from the past, so that we never repeat those mistakes. And I, especially when I'm instructing my own students at WITS, the first thing I will actually cover is representation, because it's such a fundamental issue in terms of comic making. Now, obviously, within South Africa, the medium of comics, it's at least in the traditional format of a book that you can buy that specifically has comic content, is actually very new, because we only really started with Mighty Man in terms of comic making. There were obviously underground zines, and there were a few other smaller titles that were popping up here and there, but nothing was as consistent actually as Mighty Man. And that was an interesting fact, because while we had access to international titles, especially mostly British and French titles, we didn't have much of our own. And that's quite a fascinating thing here. Now, Denzil's obviously extensively covered the history and overt themes of Mighty Man. So what I want to look at rather is actually the kind of weird background that actually occurred when it came to the making of this particular title. So Africomics, as Denzil mentioned, ran only for 2 years. So it ran from the year 1976 to 1978, and unfortunately ended with the flaming demise of Mighty Man during the Soweto uprising, and where, as was mentioned, he was literally set on fire and used as an example. So this was quite fascinating, because the artists behind it were not South African. They were actually, it was actually a pair of Americans. So, it was Joe Orlando and Richard Manville that were the creative team behind this. And they were literally recruited to actually to propagate subservience. It was their greatest modus operandi was to go, listen to the government. They're the good guys. You must always pay attention to them and do exactly what they say. Now, the fascinating thing was that Joe Orlando, who was the actual artist, not the writer, he was the actual artist, was actually told in an interview much later on, actually revealed that there were several guidelines that the team was given by the apartheid government, especially in terms of never, ever making any kind of negative view on the government visible in the comic. They were not allowed to criticize any policies. It literally had to say apartheid is right and nothing else is. That was kind of the big mandate in terms of the creation. And then another interesting fact was that Orlando actually mentioned initially when they were planning the creation of the comic that he wanted to include one-page outlines of heroes for Black readers to identify with. Now, this was a very big thing. So he acknowledged the need for this to have inspirational figures and to help people actually identify with other people that were struggling in the same way as them. And one of the most important figures that Orlando was working on profiling was the slain leader of the anti-Portuguese struggle in West Africa's Guinea-Bissau, who was Amilcar Cabral. And I think we can all understand why that didn't happen, because revolutionaries are never a good thing to inspire well-behaved people. So I think that was kind of the big intention, the big issue that the government had with Orlando's ideas. And so it was that was the sad part, was there actually were these kind of discussions happening in the background, and they acknowledged the issues and they acknowledged the kind of problematic foibles that were occurring when they're creating these titles. And so it wasn't necessarily the creative team's fault overtly, but I do think the big issue was that two Americans were asked to draw a comic about a character based in Soweto, that, which is a place neither had ever seen, neither had ever been to, and had basically no context of. So you'll notice, if you ever get a chance to read the comics, that the locations are incredibly generic. They kind of just look like a rundown city center. There's nothing identifyingly South African about these titles at all, which is very interesting, because as you noticed when Denzil was speaking, he often mentions that these are African scum, this is African this is African that, but there's nothing that actually gives us visual signifiers that there is any kind of South African element to this. And here's the scary fact: 47,000 copies of this comic were made before it was set on fire. And so that's a lot of distribution. And that was the strangest fact of this whole thing, was that it was so massively distributed. It was handed out for over 2 years. And scarily enough, there was even actually a film made of this in 1978. And through a series of very strange events, it just kind of disappeared off the face of the earth. So a lot of these things did happen, but I'm kind of glad that it didn't, to be fully honest. But I think Denzil covered this in such detail that I'm not going to linger much longer. I've already overspoken my time limit here. So I'm going to quickly pop on over to some more interesting examples from contemporary times. So here I've got two very modern titles. The first, the title on the left is from a comic called Mengumus, and the comic on the right is from Crossroads, I Live Where I Like. The title, so let's starting with Mengumus. It's by a Cape Townian artist named Willem Samuel, and it's an absolutely superb autobiographical comic series about his life growing up in the Cape. So it starts with his early high school days, and then in issue 1, and then issue 2 is basically focused around matric, and then the other 2 issues that succeeded these deal with his kind of early 20s and then his contemporary life now. And the incredible fact here is that Willem lived a very interesting and imaginative life. So often he kind of superimpose events there in terms of things like driving to school. Instead of just sitting in his dad's beaten up old Golf, he used to drive on Judge Dredd's Lawbringer, because he had quite good access to titles like 2000 AD. So comics always held a very important part in his life. But if we actually look at the example on the screen, he deals with a very interesting element of apartheid that people tend to overlook. And that's of what he informally terms a bergie. It's in a much nicer way, it's a homeless person. And it's actually speaking about how these people became dispossessed during the apartheid era. And he even mentions things like it was kind of weird that she's in what's called a white area, so where his school was. So she would often linger around the school asking for money, asking for cigarettes, and it's even the way they speculate about how she burned her face. And it's a heart-rending and terribly painful thing to look at. But the dialogue and the way she actually deals with Willem's character is actually quite funny. So there's a really strange element where Willem acknowledges, especially as a person of mixed race himself, that he had to deal with a lot of issues around his position in a white school, in a very predominantly white area, and the kind of weird things that would happen that most people wouldn't even acknowledge. They'd see it in the background and go, "Ugh, it's not my problem." But to him, he modernizes and contemporizes it with this incredibly meaningful piece of art. All of his comics are black and white. And I think it's actually a good thing, because the visuals are so much more striking and so much more powerful in terms of their representation. Then if we quickly hop over to Crossroads. Crossroads is also, it's by the Trantrol brothers. So their first title was Coloureds, and again, it deals with them growing up as two mixed race brothers and the kinds of weird things again that happened to them. But the interesting thing about Crossroads is it's about the settlement that was formed by a bunch of women revolutionaries, because they actually refused to be dispossessed and to be removed by the government. And a lot of the time, especially in this historical era, the biggest issue that this particular comic covers is that It's a quote from the writer, Dr. Connie Benson, is that the women's actions were often oversimplified by the media. So they just said a bunch of women just refused to move. And so the thing about this title is it's actually covering far more important elements and the decisions that were made, the risks that were taken, and the kind of pain and struggle that these particularly amazing women had to deal with to actually kind of circumnavigate the issues of apartheid and find a safe and comfortable place to live for their families. And it's a remarkable story, and I highly recommend that everyone actually take a look at it. Then to end off my section, there's also a very interesting revolution in contemporary South African comics, where we often speculate about a lot of things. And this particular frame is taken from Daniel Hichu's comic Iman September, which is available in the Velocity anthology. And this one actually asks the question, if South Africa was not colonized by the West, but rather by the Ottoman Empire, what would have happened? And it's an absolutely fascinating take on the kind of influences that the Middle East would have had, and how society would have functioned differently, the function of religion, the architecture, everything in and around it. And it's a fascinating question of almost a kind of counter-colonization, and instead of having having a white hegemony and kind of forced upon people, what would have happened if we were actually rather populated by the Middle East? And it's an interesting and kind of really thought-provoking take on such a weird topic. And it's one of those things that unfortunately slipped under the radar because Velocity was such a limited run that by the time the anthology was complete, not many people had actually bought it. It is actually still available on Comixology to this day, but it's quite a gem to actually own a few copies of these, because the story is collected in parts. So it runs like a pulp magazine, where each chapter of the story is actually presented in the anthology itself. So I think there is a good place for me to finish up my discussion, because I have overspoken my time a little bit. I apologize for that. But yeah, so obviously we'll address some questions and further comments later. But thank you for your time on that regard.
Ray, that's excellent presentation, and what Ray says is so critical, that you need to understand your past in order to go forward, and I mean, this is what this whole session is about, is understanding that. And for me, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the introduction to our creation, Yusef and I's creation, Jupiter Invincible. So I'm just going to share my screen. So for me, this is our character, Jupiter Invincible. This started back in summer of 2019. I was invited by the American Arts Incubator to do some workshops in Durban on how to use comics in augmented reality. And there I met several of the freedom fighters, as you call them, who fought against apartheid. And they were telling me their stories, both Indian and African, Black African, South African. And they were telling me their stories about their time in apartheid and how what the stories that were sort of around that, and to an extent to the end of apartheid. Because at that time, when apartheid was happening and the end of apartheid, I was still in like high school, late middle school. So obviously it was in the news, but it was historic when I didn't remember it as much. And I became fascinated by these stories, and I went to Johannesburg into the Apartheid Museum and started researching Gandhi, who obviously is South African, was born in South Africa, and was dealt with apartheid for most of his earlier part of his life, and went to the prison where he was imprisoned and started researching apartheid, and especially in the Apartheid Museum, which was eye-awakening for me, and to understand the history of South Africa. And I remember looking at some of these photos from the beginning of the apartheid in the early 20th century, setting up the system and everything. And what was kind of interesting, I looked at these photos and I said, wow, these photos look exactly like Jim Crow era in the United States. And later on, I learned then when the apartheid government was creating the apartheid system, they actually researched and talked to people in the various states in the South, in the Jim Crow era, because they said, if we're going to create a repressive system to keep one group of people down in our country, let's look at some models that are very effective. And they looked at Jim Crow as the model to create apartheid in South Africa. Later on, I learned that even the Nazi government under Germany, in order to repress Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, and other groups, they also looked at the Jim Crow system in the United States as a way of repressing other groups. So this started getting me thinking about creating a comic book character of an enslaved African American right before the Civil War, who is suddenly given this power of invincibility. Because I always believe, I love the idea of mixing supernatural powers, magical realism, which Yusef will talk a little bit about, and sort of superhero motifs, which everyone knows, and of course right now are insanely popular, and mixing them into a comic book story that deals with very contemporary issues, but in this sense, we're dealing with history. So this led to this idea of creating Jupiter. And when I came back from my trip to South Africa, which I spent almost about 6 weeks there, I then was brought into a residency in Maryland, which is in near Washington, D.C. It's the Baltimore area. It's a place called Columbia. But basically, I explored the entire state of Maryland. And I started going to some of the plantations, Hampton Plantation, which is a big plantation in Maryland, where there were slaves during before the Civil War. And I went and visited many of the slave quarters, a lot of them falling apart, but some of them preserved by the federal government. And I just took a lot of photos, research, went through a lot of historical archives. Through the Library of Congress was an enormous resource for me, because they had one of the biggest digital archives of not only images, but narratives of former slaves, which were collected around the time of the Great Depression in the United States. At that time, these former slaves were in their 80s and 90s, and they just collected audios and transcripts of their stories. And all of these really helped inform me about our own history, of America's history. And the reason I was kind of just astounded by this is because, and this is very indicative of most Americans in the United States as school children, is they were never taught anything about slavery, or very little. In fact, the 12 years of my grade school, the only time that it was ever a discussion about slavery is when they played Alex Haley's definitive book, which was made into a mini series called Roots. And they played that over 3 nights. That was it. They showed it. There was no discussion about it afterwards. And that was it. And there was no other focus on any African-American or even any other minority or indigenous groups in the United States, their histories. Or if there was a discussion of that, it was in the context of sort of Thomas Jefferson or Abe Lincoln or any of these big historical figures. So that was the only discussion or presentation of any African-American history or slavery that I was presented to. And I felt it was very important, as Ray said, to understand our own history in order to go forward. And this is where this idea of this comic book came. And I'm just going to show you some panels from it. The story, again, is about Jupiter, who's suddenly given this power of immortality, and he's an enslaved person on this plantation in Maryland. This plantation is very much representative of the Hampton Plantation that I was taking photos and everything else. It also involves Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman is, of course, one of the sort of heroes, in our case, superhero, who was in charge of the Underground Railroad, freed many African Americans from the South into the North and eventually into Canada. And she's a part of this story as well. Bring on Yusef here, because I think the really important part of this comic book, of course, is Yusef, who really, my idea was very rudimentary. I had this high concept idea, but it was really Yusef that grounded this comic book. And I'm going to bring him into the discussion and talk a little bit about his history, and about, of course, Jupiter Comics. Yusef, I'm going to pin you to the top here, and I'm going to remove myself. So Yusef is now in focus. So Yusef, can you talk a little bit about? I mean, you and I have traveled all over the world, and we actually traveled down to New Orleans and Louisiana. And I would love to have you share your own history of growing up in Louisiana and some of the influences and characters that you met as a child that helped inform you in creating this comic.
Well, it's interesting because the people I grew up with, I think, have very little to do with the comic. But what I would like to say is this, is that there was always an illusion of freedom in my community as such. And I realized the reason for that is that a number of people owned their own land. Though there weren't hundreds of acres or anything of the sort, there were small plots and what have you. There was an illusion of freedom. From the onset, for me, I confronted Jupiter Invincible as a poet. So it's a place where history and the imagination converge. And there wasn't an idea of psychological warfare, let's say that. I wanted to surprise myself. And my first surprise was this. Jupiter is an albino. And consequently, I grew up with a family close by me as a kid, you know, who were albinos. And the fact that there weren't any tension between us as such. I understand this to be slightly different if we were in parts of Africa. Just the fact that the character is albino. The other thing is this. I wanted Jupiter to at least have an illusion of power. And consequently, with that illusion, it becomes a reality. What he says early on is this: my heart is not a slave. And that gives him all the power that he needs as an individual to function in that very circumscribed world as such. The other thing is this, is that growing up in Louisiana, we had just ordinary citizens who had a certain kind of audacity. A good example of that is the fact that during the civil rights movement, I don't know if you've heard of this group, the Deacons for Defense. They had the audacity to arm themselves and face the Ku Klux Klan and force the Knights of the White Camellia underground. I wanted Jupiter to possess an element of that audacity, not to function as a supreme character in a very circumscribed, limited environment, but to dream beyond. So it's all about dreams, really.
Well, can you talk a little about the dreams and especially magical realism, which I know is a big part of this comic, but also a lot of your own poetry deals with that as well.
Okay, let's say in a place of magical realism, let's come to surrealism first, which essentially means what? Super reality. So then we can jump to magical realism. I think it has a lot to do with what Jupiter comes in contact with and how he deals with it. And also by the fact that, I should say, the fact that his mother dies in childbirth and he is struck by lightning later on when he's 19 years old. and he collides gently with this netherworld. And I don't even think that he is aware of his powers as such. They are revealed to him slowly, as if a text is unfolding. So it doesn't, I would like to say, it doesn't have the hype of a lot of the comic books that I see. For instance, I remember reading, you know, let's face it, Superman, Mighty Man. Talking about Mighty Man, it was hard for me not to think of Superman. And of course, Dick Tracy with all of his thingamajigs, right? That are high tech, what we're dealing with now, right? That's why we're on Zoom, I suppose, Dick Tracy. But I feel like he's a character that can be seen as ordinary, and yet there are moments that reveals this kind of super reality. And that's his power. He doesn't always remain with the cape on because he doesn't have a cape.
After he's struck by lightning, Jupiter, he goes to the netherworld, and which brings him back to Africa, where he discovers the golden stool and that he's from this long lineage in Africa. And then he comes back and he changes from an albino African-American to a dark-skinned Black African-American. Can you talk a little bit about the representation of that image and how that is perceived in literature, but also, sorry.
Yes, in retrospect, I think it has something to do with the fact that when I was very small and would look at the family across the fence, the albino family, there were also in the family the father who was very dark-skinned, and one of the boys was dark-skinned. So just reckoning with that image as such, I think that sort of influenced the idea as well. So in a certain sense, it's not really that far removed from reality, especially seeing it through my own eyes as such. For myself, writing poetry, it's always close to experience, but also slightly beyond.
Well, the last question I have is, I believe you've been to South Africa, or have you been to South Africa? Or
I haven't been to South Africa. I've been invited a few times, but it was always the wrong time for me as such.
Right.
I've been to, of course, West Africa.
Right. Yusef and I went to Ghana together. So I think we should sort of bring in the audience here and have them ask any questions. I do want to acknowledge one other person, Ashley A. Woods. She's the illustrator of the comic, which you saw the images of. Let's bring in the audience if they have any, they want to ask any questions, and then I'll conclude by playing like a 1-minute video clip to show the augmented reality in Jupiter Invincible. If anyone wants to add anything in the chat, or if they raise their hand, I can turn your video audio on. Or if Denzil or Ray or Yusef or myself have any questions for any of either, please be free to ask.
I think, Denzil, while we're waiting for any questions, I thought it was quite funny that you put Ntati Molefe on there, just because of there happens to be a certain person's name on the cover of that title. So
Yeah.
I remember distinctly working in the environment of Ntati Molefe with Gush and the team. And the interesting thing about that as well was the method of production that was used in it, because Oscar as the artist actually had no access to any kind of technology whatsoever. So Yusef, you were mentioning technology a little bit earlier. So Oscar actually developed that entire comic using coloring pencils. So he's actually a petrol attendant that works quite far out in a very remote area, and the process of working back and forward was actually interesting. And so I actually thought that in terms of the authenticity of work, and especially considering that we're about to look at an augmented reality comic, I wanted to actually ask all of you your kind of impression on the aura of comics and sort of where in them situated, and the authenticity of digital versus traditional, for example. So I mean, with Ram and Yusef, you guys have obviously worked in a very new medium of augmented reality. That's it's essentially, it's not just a matter of adding in a few extra things, it's actually adding a whole new layer of narrative, and especially considering your previous work on Priya Shakti. So what is your thoughts or take on that? So the kind of the authenticity of, well, the aura of authenticity in terms of stories and comic making.
Sure. I mean, I can talk a little bit about the AR because that really came from a lot of my research. So I'm a documentary filmmaker. That's what I mostly do, and I always believe integrating those documentary elements, those story elements, into the comics, into Priya Shakti, and also into Jupiter Invincible. So one of the unique things we did with Jupiter is we integrated a lot of the photos, the stories, the slave quarters. All of that was integrated, the photos, into the AR. So when you scan the pages, the pages would transform into the actual photos. Each of the scenes that Ashley used were based on photos that I took. So they reverted back to that, and you would actually see it and then put it into historical context with some text. So for me, the AR was a great educational tool for people, but also AR, and I mean, which I think you can take that to the next level, because a lot of people sometimes just read the comic from cover to cover and they see the writing and the visuals. And I always say with AR, you can go back to the beginning and start over and literally see the comic book in a different light and almost open the curtain on how it was created and the historical context of it. And I think that's a very unique aspect. And then there's the other part of it, which I think AR is really cool about, because you have to understand the audience that we're focused on, which are teenagers. We added a lot of animation and these kind of eye-popping elements into it, which you need to kind of draw people in with the technology, because people want that spectacle as well. So it's always a good balance of doing that. I think the more effective, and I say quote AR comics because there really aren't that many out there. The ones who do it can kind of balance both of those things, those two things together, without affecting the purity of the comic book form. In the end, AR comics basically turned a comic book into a pop-up book. Those beautiful pop-up books you open up, and that's what AR can really do effective on. Do you have a question, Garrett? I think you're back on mute. I'm not sure.
Well, I think maybe God can type it up and we'll pull it from the text. While God is maybe typing his question, I think Ray asks an interesting question, and I think Ram, your contrast with the enhancements of AR in the US in the model context is something that we need to also think about the context of production in South Africa. I mean, we've looked at some of the comic books that are being produced. It's costly for a lot of them, especially if they are doing this by self-production. A lot of them are starting their own little comic book companies and producing their own. And one of the challenges that I noted when we were at Comic-Con was that the self-production, self-publication is costly for a lot of them. They fund it on their own, which is a major challenge. And I've seen comic books that are in your traditional newspaper, the old brown newspaper style kind of comic. I mean, that's exactly what they are producing. And while that production, I mean, we've got strides away from the kind of AR development that you are talking about. I think the good thing about this is that there is an attempt towards self-production of these knowledges. And that's where we need to start moving towards the capturing of those type of discourses at a very grassroots level and producing it at a cost-effective approach. Unfortunately, we don't, and that's one of the biggest challenges, the funding. Everyone I spoke to, the major challenge for the South African context is funding. And as I said, it's not something that you can easily say that it's something that can generate a lot of profit for you, because it's not. It's a subculture, but the thing is, from a profit margin perspective, it's not much. So I think Ray, getting to where RAM for it's just my kind of thinking, Ray. Getting to where RAM is with the 4IR, I think we are a long way away from that at the current state.
Yeah. And because I actually wanted to follow up my question that I asked you all earlier, is how do you avoid the gimmick factor of AR? Because we actually have seen quite a prolific rise of digital comic content in the African continent as a whole, particularly in East and West Africa, with Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya leading the way actually in terms of comic production and comic sales. You need only look at a resource like Kugali Media, and where they've seen such great success that they've even reached out now to co-produce series with Disney. So there's some really interesting things that are coming from the greater African diaspora. And just to answer Garth's question, interestingly, no, I have not heard of the Storyteller Group. So that's actually a really great question to ask, because I'm not familiar with them at all. So I was sharing a slide just now talking about the 90s era was dominated by bitter comics. So that was Conrad Burtis and Anton Kannemeyer. And their comics were mostly self-reflective works based on their own experiences as youth growing up in apartheid, and the various things that they encountered and the kind of horrors that they experienced as well. And then just also to follow up, let me just scroll back up. Apparently my chat box is now crashing. But I was also just following up with Nicholas's question as well, where it was very much, Mighty Man was specifically aimed at people in Soweto. So it was aimed at the youth. It was very affordable. It was very cheap to buy. And so it was literally used as a kind of youth-oriented propaganda device, much like several animated series were at the time as well. So it was a very effective way of doing it. And it actually did have good sales. So as you mentioned, 47,000 units sold is not a bad thing for a South African comic. And so that was the thing, is that it was aimed specifically at this audience that actually did consume it. But the reaction during the Soweto uprising was actually quite telling in terms of literally using the one thing they had as fuel to burn, to start fires. So I think that was the main thing there.
I mean, our goal, Yusef and our goal is to eventually do in the fall, try to get into schools, into libraries in the US. Internationally, we haven't thought about international, but mainly in the US as an educational tool, but also as a way to talk about race and resilience in the US, because obviously that is a major topic right nowadays and has always been. So that's the plan. And Yusef, I'm just going to pin him as well. Yeah. So Yusef and I are also doing a theatrical production of Jupiter Invincible with the Stella Adler Acting Studio in New York City. And July 8th, it's a Zoom event, but eventually we're going to do a physical. How do you, this is an interesting thing I think we can briefly talk about, is how to interpret comics into other forms. Like how's the experience of turning a comic book, Jupiter, into a theatrical production for you?
Well, it's interesting for a simple reason, because the characters sort of expand, but also they become more active. And consequently, with a comic book, I think there's kind of a co-creator of meaning, where the reader or the listener is not told everything, not told how to think, but to actually participate. That's the most important thing. Not to be a passive reactor. But yes, that's the way to go, I think.
Yes, I mean it's a free event. Anyone can sign up. I know it'll be very late time-wise in South Africa, but I do also want to mention that we are giving the Jupiter Invincible on our website, powerofjupiter.com, for free. Anyone can download it in all the formats for free, whether it's Comicology, PDF, you name it. And we're encouraging everyone to download it and just share it, to everyone as possible. We want to disseminate this story as broadly as possible. So
be ready for the actors, because essentially they bring a lot of experience and a lot of feeling to the characters.
Well, I see a lot of discussion still happening in the chat. Ray or Denzil, a lot of very specific to South Africa. Did you two want to add anything to anything that's in the chat? Or I see you're also replying back and forth.
Yeah, I think the focus on the South African one more specifically is the transformative elements of the South African comics. And if you look at some of those that are produced, I think it's a matter of trying to rethink how comic books address specific issues. But what we've also noticed is a counter kind of imaging to the traditional Marvel DC comics that is occurring. So this is quite interesting that the localization of and production of these comics, the kind of imaging plus the type of discourse that are happening. So I think there's a lot of potential, but at the same time, I mean, we really need to think that these are, I mean, the South African context, this is a very fairly new market of production, which means that the challenge of really buying and competing with your Marvel and your DC comics is a major challenge. So this is something I think we'll have to give a little bit more time for South African creators to really get noticed in the space. And I think one of the ways that is the localization of African Comic Cons, etc., that creates this kind of spaces for interaction. And unfortunately, COVID impacted us negatively, but I'm hoping that we can actually really think of how we use mediums like this to give those authors those space to,
Yeah, and to further on that, if you have a look on the screen right now, this was actually one of our first major publishing houses that was created by Media 24 way back in the day in the early 2000s. And Mshana Comics was actually really one of the first localized and located comics that existed. And you could see it was very affordable. They used to sell the issues for R7 a pop. And it was actually really exciting because within the context, it told stories from all across South Africa. So there were crime thrillers, there was comedy comics, basically everything you could think of. They actually covered a lot of the different storytelling, and it was created by one of my dear friends, Moray Roda. He's been one of the longest and most established features and people within the South African comic community for the longest time. And if we look at the timeline over here, so you can actually see Beat Comics itself lasted only a year. Unfortunately, as Denzil mentioned, the case is funding just goes poof, and then we can't really produce any further. But we've been making successive comics since as early as the 2000s in terms of commercially successful titles. And then we moved on all the way through to what's now called the independents. So we've got characters like Super Dad that's educational themed and deals with specifically with the teenage audience and kind of themes that you'd expect in high school. This was one of the Velocity issues where I shamelessly plug myself. And this is Moray, and then this is Naz Hussein, who unfortunately passed away the earlier this year due to COVID, but he was one of our most prolific writers as well. So it's not just about making comics, but it's also a great space for writers that can actually do incredible things. And you need only look at the team behind Kwezi to actually show that kind of success. And the fact that they're busy producing an animated series at the moment. And actually, now that reminds me, Ram, you guys also presented with Comic-Con Africa. So I know that you made Jupiter's Legacy available through Comic-Con Africa's channels, and you also did a podcast on it. So there's definitely ways that you are reaching the youth, especially within South Africa, because our audiences tend to love digital comics, AR work, especially because it's still, I think, at least for us, the shininess of AR hasn't worn off just yet. So it's always a good thing to actually have that technology to actually really add an additional sales point to any properties you produce.
Yeah, I mean, I think digital comics has really made it possible for many cultures in different countries to experience other cultures and other comics from other countries. I mean, I think that's what Comicology, I mean, even Adobe PDF, you name it, has really helped us to like spread the word. And yes, we did Yusef and I actually did a video conversation with Comic-Con Africa, and they were very delightful and really helped, very excited about it. So maybe there's no other questions. I'll just show the 1 minute video about the AR so people get an idea. And I do want to say this, and I said this during the Comic-Con Africa conversation. And one of the reasons why I came to South Africa is to show that this barrier of AR is not impossible, whether you're a comic book artist or even just a graphic artist or visual artist, to use and integrate into your work. Because nowadays, whether we like it or not, that's a separate question. The digital life has very much integrated into our normal lives and into our creative work as well. So AR is a good way of kind of gauging it and maybe taking your work further and trying to reach new audiences with it too. So if there's no more other questions, I'm gonna play this video and I'll come back and have any last words and say thank you for everyone for joining. Second. So with that, if anyone want to have any last comments or last questions before we kind of close this out? No? Well, I know Denzil and Ray and myself are going to keep continuing this conversation, especially with this new anthology that Denzil is spearheading. And Denzil, do you want to do any quick call out for that or announcement on that part, or it's still?
Thanks, Ram. Yeah, colleagues, we are busy with a special issue, and it'll focus on comic books and social transformation. We are busy developing the call for papers and conceptualizing. As soon as we're ready, we will circulate it, and we'll also circulate it to all those that may have attended today as well. And as Ray and I engaged earlier in the week, the idea is not just for academic pieces, but to give a critical publication space for even producers, for artists, to use this as a space to start discussing some of these critical elements. So please watch the space for the call for papers. We will circulate it shortly. Thanks, Ram.
Great. Well, I'm bringing everyone on the screen, and I want to thank Yusef, Denzil, Ray for this remarkable conversation. And I hope to be back in South Africa in the future. I mean, I hope to bring Yusef if he's up for it as well, and because there's so much to learn in that country. And thank you again, everyone. Stay well.
Thanks.
Stay safe.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.